Thank you, Nigel. Wonderful to be here. And thank you also for giving us an hour and a half. I thought about why we're getting an hour and a half. And I remember Denise Plummer singing Woman is Boss at the March Grind 1988 and winning. So it looks like woman still boss because Elsa is in the region. So that's why we have all this time.
Yep.
But besides that, one of the things when we spoke about COVID-19, and by the way, Nigel and I had a little chat last night, just to prepare. I thought about this whole issue about COVID-19. And, you know, COVID-19, the message is nature is boss. What nature is telling us is that we don't have any control over nature. Nature controls us, and we need to adjust ourselves in humanity in order to suit. And that's where I really actually want to go this afternoon. So I'm glad we have the time to do it. And I hope this will be the session that people regretted that they missed, because maybe we might call it the Confessions of Douglas Orane over my business career. So one of the things I actually did, you notice I'm wearing a t-shirt because I wanted to be the first person for the entire week who presented in a t-shirt. And there's a message in it. What do we do in the future about dress codes now that we're in the middle of a pandemic and when we come out of it? Nobody has yet said, no, Doug, you can't wear a t-shirt when you're online. But I probably would if I were at the office, especially if I were the chairman and CEO. Of course, if you're Mark Zuckerberg, you can wear a black t-shirt anywhere. So, because that's standard dress in Silicon Valley. So let's come back to where we are. Nigel, I want to just share why I'm so passionate about corporate governance. So here goes. When I joined Grace Kennedy, it was a business that was not listed on a stock exchange in 1981. That didn't happen until 1986. And I want to thank the Kennedy family, who really were very far-sighted in saying, we need to find a way in order to grow this business. And they were into the second and third generations by bringing in and encouraging professional management. And I was part of that core group that came up through the group. And it started before me. So I think the philosophy that they had was better to own the slice of a watermelon rather than the whole of a grape. And it's worked. And I'll give you a practical example of it. You will hear from Nigel, you just heard from him. I actually retired 10 years ago in 2011 as group CEO. People said, what? I can't believe that. And in fact, when I walk around Kingston, people say it all the time, every 2 weeks it happens. They said, hi, Mr. Webby, how are you? You're doing such a great job running Grace Kennedy. I said, no, I'm not Don Webby. That's my successor. But you've made my day because I must be looking really young. And in addition to that, he must be doing a really great job. So has this younger generation done a great job? Gail Solomon was on earlier. And when, when I was coming up to the 10th anniversary, which was this Wednesday, I did a calculation the day I retired and where we are today. The market capitalization of Grace Kennedy in US dollars is triple what it was when I retired 10 years ago. So this fear that a lot of in the older generation of is, boy, if I let go, then we'll mash up the place, you know. Nonsense, absolute nonsense. In fact, it's a way to create value. And why am I so passionate about this multi-generational methodology? Because one of the companies I respect more than most is Nestle. And Nestle started in the 1880s, I believe, in a little village called Vevre in Switzerland as a dairy company. And it's now the largest food company in the world. We can do that too. Grace Kennedy can do that. In fact, that's our objective to do that. But probably in a different niche from those who went before us. So all things are possible in that regard. When I was in Grace Kennedy, Fred Kennedy always wanted the company to be listed. Carlton Alexander made it happen. And here's now the next reason why I'm so passionate about corporate governance. The late chairman, Carlton Alexander, he would get a group of youngsters together in the 1980s. And he said, youngsters, you ever heard of these companies? And he'd reel off about the names of 10 companies. There's only one that I recognize. And I said, why did you mention those, sir? He says, when I joined Grace Kennedy as a young man in the 1930s, they were all bigger than Grace Kennedy, and none of them exist today. So the world doesn't owe us a living. And one of the risks with size is that we can get complacent. And I see corporate governance as a way as keeping us on track and jolting us to do what's the right thing, which is simple. Let's please our customers and they will look after us in that regard. So if I can just move on to what I do today, because you will have seen that I'm a great fan of succession planning. I'm a free agent. I can speak completely freely now because I retired from the board of Grace Kennedy 3 years ago. I retired as chairman in 2014. I retired as the CEO in 2011. And I've devoted myself to other things, which is really about helping the younger generation to prepare for the future. So I do it in different ways. I'm on the board of the RJR Gleaner. It's a listed company on the Jamaica Stock Exchange. And you can ask, well, why did I choose that one? And the reason is I have a passionate belief in our democracy being sustainable. And it can only be sustainable if we have a vibrant media. And we are at risk of not having it, not only in the Caribbean, but throughout the world. I'll come back to that later because it actually relates to how effective governance works. So the other things I do is that I help not-for-profits. So I'm on not-for-profits boards, which is a real trip because talk about corporate governance in the private sector. I thought politics was only in political parties, but not-for-profits is right up there. So that's where we actually need a frontier in terms of expanding corporate governance. So the other thing I do is I am a member of First Angels, which is an angel investing group, because I recognize that there is a gap in our financial markets in the Caribbean for young people, mainly, who have ideas but don't have the capital, the equity to carry the idea to a post-revenue position. So let's come back to the topic. So the topic, subsidiary and parent company boards, changing governance is needed, lessons from COVID-19 restrictions. So I've already said what the lesson is. Nature is boss. We have to readjust to that. I am a person who has the greatest respect for Black Swan events, and those who may not know what Black Swan events are, it's events that you can't even think of until they happen. And this is one of them. And we have to learn from that, but there are others. Remember, we had a virtually identical pandemic in 1918-19, which from my research probably killed 100,000 people in the Caribbean. So it was far worse than this one. Have we learned from it? I have to say, based on the research I've done, we haven't, because most people don't even remember that pandemic in the Caribbean. I haven't found very much literature in it, except in the archives of the Gleaner. What we need to do is to use this pandemic for the great leap forward. And I don't mean it in the way it's been used in the past, but for us in the Caribbean to leapfrog to becoming developed countries. So we're really in a live experiment of massive change. And so there are a few things that struck me as I observed this disruption taking place. This primary one is the disruption of the customer company link, and how do we maintain that? One of the things that I've used the pandemic to do is to do a lot of research online. And early on, there was some research that showed that 85% of companies in the world were losing sales, but 15% were increasing their sales during the pandemic. And they actually gave tips as to how to get into that 15%. And that's where companies need to go. The next one is the disruption of supply chains, which is very similar and requires very innovative management. The next one is employee availability. Well, they're not physically around because you can't have them in this environment. And so how do you get them to work? And also the social issues of group cohesiveness. In addition to that, it raises another thing which people don't like to talk about. People die in a pandemic. So if you lose valuable people, how will you replace them? And I find there's not a lot of thought given to that, but it's very, very important in that regard. And in fact, Gail Solomon mentioned the whole development of succession planning at Grace Kennedy, which has worked very well in that regard. So that's the other issue, succession planning for everyone in the company, full-time employees as well as the board of directors. The succession planning at board level is something that needs a lot of attention in the Caribbean, because I think our culture, for historical reasons, we have fallen in love with gerontocracies. What do I mean by that? We have fallen in love with companies and organizations that are run by old people. And that's not only in the private sector, it's in our political parties, it's in the churches, it's in associations of professionals, it's in NGOs. And one of the things that we need to recognize, and we're speaking to the converted on this call, so we need to spread the word out there, is doing that is actually a prescription for value destruction, not value creation. This new, let me stay around because I don't know what these youngsters are going to do, is a very bad idea. And it's better to prepare and do it well and then see what the results is. Of course, the other practical issue is that if it doesn't go the way you want, you have time in order to change course in that regard. The other big one, a huge one that's jumped out at me in terms of what I see happening is cybersecurity and the mushrooming of the risks involved of doing business remotely. And particularly, for example, the whole issue of ransom attacks using cyber systems is very, very dangerous. And most people don't even want to think about it, but you have to think about it in terms of your governance. What happens if you get hacked and you have no access to your data? What are you going to do as a company? So the next one I point to, which is the final one I have on my list, is long-term strategy. And that is what is happening is causing all businesses to rethink their long-term strategies. What's the purpose of the business in today's world? Maybe it has no purpose anymore, or maybe there's a huge opportunity to expand, but there has to be thought about it rather than going back to what it was prior to 2019. I have other comments, but I'm going to stop there and then ask for comments, questions. Let's get a conversation going, and also pick up page 2 of my notes, which just blew off onto the floor. By the way, one of my, as my family, we don't have any air conditioning in our home. It's all louver windows. And we have been doing that for decades, but then, hey, guess what? We have discovered it's one of the best ways to prevent COVID-19 from spreading. So, Kamla, sorry to hear you're in an air-conditioned room there and feeling cold.
Thank you very much, Douglas. That was an excellent introduction. The where I want to go with the whole conglomerate thing is that what COVID has done, and you mentioned a few of them, and for me, what I look for is the opportunity. So I was in I was in Hong Kong for SARS, and SARS was basically a non-event. We wore our mask and we went about our business. But what this global pandemic has done, and I've read recently where there is some evidence to suggest that the scientists who were working on understanding the virus allowed it, not deliberately, but because of lack of controls, to escape. And where it escaped is debatable, but the fact is it did. And you mentioned link to the customer, supply chain management. One of my, and we share this, the threat of cybersecurity. It suggests to me that the Grace Kennedys of this world, the Ansa McCalls, the Massey's, need to look at solving these issues holistically. And of course, you have the tension between the direction from the center and given the guys on the front lines in the subsidiaries or the businesses spread over the various territories, the freedom to act and the independence to make decisions in a rapid manner. And you have that tension compared to the need for policies that would address these global threats, cybersecurity for one, the governance that should be put in place to ensure that the teams on the ground are managing within those kinds of constraints, or else they expose the group to serious threat. And also the efficiencies of scale that you would get as you grow the group and are able to provide services, what we in Citibank used to call shared services, to all the entities in the group without having to duplicate the service in each entity. And the question I have for you in that regard is, did you look at that in Grace Kennedy, one, and what was the response? Because I want to share with you afterwards the kind of responses I've seen and the reason I believe that we have not matured enough to understand shared services in the way that the multinationals do.
Well, thanks for the lead into that. And so I'll step back since you asked about Grace Kennedy. I wasn't going to talk about Grace Kennedy at all. But since you asked, so when I arrived at Grace Kennedy in 1981, we were in a closed society. Most people can't imagine what it was like. You needed to get an import license to import everything. After you got the import license, you had to go to the central bank in order to get the permission to get the foreign exchange to pay for it. When you tell that to a 25-year-old person, they said, what are you talking about? It was a totally different world, but it had massive consequences for the way businesses work. And here's the example that I'll give you. If you start a successful restaurant in Chicago, a fast food restaurant, it works well, you make profits. You say, hey, this is great. You say, well, I can replicate it. I can move from Chicago and do the same thing in New York and Atlanta and Miami and grow a chain of identical businesses that will number in the scores and the hundreds. And many entities have done that, including Caribbean people. In the middle of the 20th century, because we had a closed economy, and it's not only Jamaica, all the other English-speaking countries were like that. You started a restaurant, it did well in Jamaica. You say, what am I going to do next? Well, there's not room for a second one like this in my small country. Let me buy a travel agency. And then it starts off a chain reaction of unrelated diversification. And you see it right across the Caribbean and Latin America. What I realized when I joined Grace Kennedy, and I was in my early 30s, and the economy was opening up, is that that model was no longer sustainable. And it's for a simple reason. The reason is when we were competing in a particular industry, let's say the travel, Grace Kennedy used to own a travel agency. When we're competing with a travel agency that we own, the persons who were competing with us, that's all they did. So they had 24 hours a day to think about how to really run a great travel agency. We had 30 minutes because we had to then move on to food manufacturing and distribution and wharf activities and all the other things and making metal fencing, which is one of the other companies that we had. So what I recognized is that we had to simplify the company. That process has gone on for 30 years. And under Don Webby's leadership, it has been completed because we have streamlined the Grace Kennedy Group down to two core businesses. Food globally and financial services regionally, and that's it. Now, people used to criticize me when I was chairman and CEO. They said, Doug, how can you be selling this company? It's profitable. What's wrong with you? I said, yes, but it doesn't fit in with the rest of the group. There are no synergies. The point you have made, when you have that level of unrelated diversification, you can't get effective back office shared services because they're not common with the rest of the group. But if you are doing food all over the world or financial services in English-speaking Caribbean, you can have very effective shared services that are centralized. And then you leave out there the customer-facing businesses, which are unique, and allow your people out there to run them as they see best. I have a simple phrase for it in terms of governance, and that is compliance without stifling operations. In other words, you want people to follow the rules, but not stifle them, because one of the things that's very common in rolling out corporate governance, so we have to be careful of people's, as soon as you say corporate governance, people's eyes glaze over. You know, they think it's some highfalutin exercise. But it isn't. It's about value creation. So having said that, I think there's a lesson for that in all businesses. In fact, I would say you have to ask why any entity, if it's in a free market global environment, is not causing itself to focus on fewer businesses. In fact, I went and did a little research last night about this very topic. One of the governance rules or recommendations is to develop an entity reduction program in groups of companies. What does that mean? It means every year or every quarter, you look at all the entities you have and you say, do we really need this one? Or should we merge this one? Or should we sell it? It's a very painful exercise because it involves people's careers and a lot of emotions get involved. But there's something else. You have to prevent people from starting new ones because it's human nature. They say, oh, I have a great idea. Let's go to Grenada and start another company just like the one we have somewhere else. Fine, but is it going to create value? Or what? There may actually maybe less risk with that than to say, I'm in a particular territory, I'm in Jamaica, I'm doing fast food. Let me go and get into the solar energy business because they're totally unrelated. You have to really ask yourself, are you creating value in that regard? If you're going to go with that model, then you'd have to go as a private equity investor or a venture capitalist, which is a totally different business model from the one we're discussing here in terms of management and control of the organizations. But I have a little list, Nigel, of ideas for how to have proactive governance of subsidiaries. So here goes. First one, tone from the top. Parent company board has to live and breathe this. And if they don't, you have the wrong directors. Second, review the subsidiary boards regularly. And there's a process for doing that, and the previous session dealt with that. Next one, make all policies available group-wide. I keep on being surprised how people will create policies and then it doesn't move past the company secretary's desk or computer. So you have somebody out on the front line. You heard about our new policy on social media usage. They said, what are you talking about? Never heard of it. So we have a huge advantage now because of technology to spread it. But you have another advantage. You can actually tell who has opened it and read it. So there's no excuse. Okay, the next one is to reduce what I call the compliance burden. Because one of the things about subsidiaries, their CEOs and their management complain about, man, parent companies giving more work to do and I can't see the value in it. So, and they may have a point in certain areas, not in all, because there's obviously value for the entire group. But here are some ways to reduce compliance burden. Have a central calendar of filing deadlines. And typically I found once a year works really great. When you use once every 2 years, people forget about it somewhere. So they'll say once a year, we're going to review our corporate governance code. We're going to have annual filing of directors' interests and shareholdings, etc. Then the next one is to have clear and efficient governance workflow. In other words, whatever we're doing, we can use technology to fill out all the forms that we have that makes it so simple rather than having reams of paper flying around. And hopefully that's happening, but it may not be. And then the next one is the role of the company secretary is now completely different. It's not reactive any longer where you're keeping minutes filed. It's about being proactive and being part of the strategic future of the company in order to be fully involved in this process. And I think Gail Solomon pointed to that in the previous one, but historically, that's not the role that company secretaries play. And because now they're becoming, in effect, the gatekeepers for corporate governance. And I can tell you this, I am chairman of the corporate governance committee for RGR Gleno. I'm non-executive. I can't remember every 3 months, every 6 months, every year what's to be done. I must rely on the company secretary in order to make sure we have all of this being done in an organized way. And so it's a point, I think, that has been underplayed up to this point, that we haven't thought about carefully, and also seeing how we can help our company secretaries in that regard. So that, I thought it was a short list, but actually it seems a little longer than I believe. But let me see if anybody has any to add to the list.
Yes, and anybody wants to add or to contribute? Camille, we have Faye, we have Kamala. Go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have to add so much as I want to ask with respect to the very first point you made, which was, you know, the whole issue of the tone at the top. And Faye, you know, pointed out to me in the session earlier that we didn't have enough focus on the role of the chairman in this year's governance week. So I want to ask you, I mean, you know, in your experience, setting that tone, how does the chairman go about doing that? And if you have a chairman who may not be so proactive, how do we build a board that allows us to ensure that that very first thing on the list, the tone at the top, is what you want to be, that's going to cascade down the organization?
Okay, thank you. Well, you opened up a big issue, because when I was chairman and CEO, the most common question I got from people is, don't you think that you should give up one of them? I kept being asked that over and over. And I said, well, there are historical reasons for it. I inherited it because that's the way we evolved from a family business to a large privately held conglomerate to a listed company on the Jamaica Stock Exchange and other exchanges. But I will tell you this, I am the last person at Grace Kennedy who will hold that joint position because the world is very different in the 21st century from the 20th. In the 20th century, somebody came to you with a request as chairman and CEO and said, you need a decision. Well, usually they'd write a letter. So you had time to read it and then you could think for a week or so and then you reply. Today, somebody sends you an email and says, I need a decision from you. And if you don't have it in 10 minutes, they're going to get upset. There has been a contraction in the response time, but there's something much more fundamental that has happened. And that is in the 21st century, the multiplicity of stakeholders has increased and they have all become more vocal. So in the 20th century, you would have a chairman and CEO of a company and you'd say, well, this is the way it is. I just decided that and my board supports me, full stop. In today's world, you not only have your board and management, you have your employees at different levels. They may be in different countries, they have different cultures. You have your neighborhood communities. You have various segments of government who are saying, as a company listed on a stock exchange, you need to behave in a different way. So the conflicts of the combined role have become so great that my view is absolutely clear. It needs to be separated. They are very different roles. The chairman oversees the board of directors and the CEO runs the company. And we need to be clear on that. Having said that, then you need to go out and recruit somebody who can chair and run a board, full stop. And that doesn't have to be somebody who has experience in the business that the company is operating in. If you have inherited somebody who is there for whatever historical reasons, there are ways to handle that. The first one is to find ways for the probably the more mature directors to say, can I give you some advice on how to handle these issues? And I've found in that kind of situation, chairmen or chairpersons are willing and happy to have that happen. What happens is people very often are reluctant to approach them. And I think the big issue usually may be because they've never chaired a publicly traded company before. That's a big jump in that regard. So training and guidance is important. As in fact, maybe the chair of the corporate governance committee is the best person to do that, or one of the people. There's also another approach, and that is one should have a senior director appointed and publicly made known that if someone has an issue with the chairman that they can go to. That's, I think, standard practice in many companies. But in addition to that, I would say one of the things is to recognize that people want to improve themselves. Here is what I've found has been the biggest instrument for improving director performance is board evaluations. And you may say, yeah, but that's just filling out a series of questions. You know what I found is the most valuable part of it? The one-on-one sessions or 1 and 2 sessions after, where each individual director will meet with the chair and the chair of the board and one other director, whether it's the deputy chair or the chair of corporate governance. Because in that session, what comes out are all their inner feelings and emotions that they wouldn't put in writing. And in fact, the boards I've been on, that's where issues like, for example, you can ask the question, have you thought about when you'd like to retire? Well, you can't, it's very embarrassing in the Caribbean to ask that question in a board meeting. The people say, what, you don't like me anymore? But in that forum where people know it is confidential, and also that it is part of a process for self-improvement, and there are reasons for it, because we said, look, as Gail said 2 hours ago, it's a process of refreshing the board. We need to make room for new people, new ideas, younger people, in order to strengthen the board. And I found that has made a massive change, including in the approach of the chairperson, who may have been there for a long time in that regard.
Thank you very much. Faye has her hand up. Faye?
Hi, well, mostly I put it up to let you know that you could call on me, because you might have been looking around to see if somebody else would talk. First, Kamala, let me say, I would not accuse you of any omission in our very complete and comprehensive program. I was just putting a flag there for some future things we could do. So not at all. No, I think the list you provided for guidance in subsidiary governance is very comprehensive and very complete. I can't think of too much to add to it, except that I would emphasize the importance of having a good corporate secretariat. So especially if you have a group, sometimes it's difficult to have one person provide that corporate secretarial service, so that you actually need several or more than one corporate secretary. And I think Gail might have mentioned that sometimes that could be a very lonely job, because you sort of sit in a place between executive management and the board of directors. You have to be independent, and having a corporate secretariat gives that person in that position some additional support, opportunities for more networking and discussion and things like that. And having that corporate governance secretariat is also the effective tool for actually rolling out some of the things you mentioned, like the policies and things like that. So I think it was a great list. I saw some comments in the chat that it was a good list, and Camille's hand is up, so I will retire.
Okay, yes, hi, thanks gentlemen. It's been really enlightening so far. I have a question for Douglas. Very often we have seen in the Caribbean that where there are conglomerates, the head office tends to want to dictate and mandate. So for example, branches, close the Maypen branch, or close this other particular place, do things in a particular way that perhaps in our culture is just not suitable for our environment. How is Grace now, as the head of the conglomerate, you're sitting in Jamaica, how is Grace going to manage that aspect of being the parent company?
Well, that's a question I think you need to ask Don Webby.
No, you were there, you can answer us.
No, I don't. As I said earlier on, Camille, I've been on the board for the last 3 years.
Give us your thoughts. How should it be managed?
Okay, well, I see it happening around me, and so I can't comment on how Grace Kennedy handles it.
Yeah.
It seems very well, because I don't hear any complaints about it, which is one of the key things to look at. You know, one of the things I'll say is that responsiveness, immediate responsiveness, is one of the key skills in this environment. You have to have a network out there, a radar system, and companies do have it, where you pick up something on Twitter and within 5 minutes you can respond to it, so it doesn't take on a life of its own. Because one of the huge differences today with when I was active as chairman and CEO, especially up to the late 90s, every single person with a cell phone in this world has now become a publisher. When I was chairman and CEO, there are only 2 publishers, the Jamaica Gleaner and the Jamaica Observer. So, but this is the reality we face. So therefore, managing all of that is much more complex. And it only takes one person to say, well, I'm so upset with this company that closed the Maypen branch, and it's because, you know, they're against people from Clarendon. Or some, and then it takes on a life of its own. So But this is one of the huge issues that leaders need to grapple with, that the kind of changes that are required for us to survive and thrive are very disruptive, extraordinarily so. I went through this especially the 1990s, particularly with our manufacturing facilities. That, we eventually got to the point in the 1990s where we did everything we could to find a way to be more effective, efficient in our Jamaican factories. We would actually close the plant and go to the conference center with the 200 people working and said, look, it's not 10 competitors anymore in Jamaica, it's 6,000 across the Western Hemisphere that make ketchup. So we can't stay still, we'll go out of business. And in many cases we couldn't. So we had to actually make the decision. I had to make the personal choice. It was a very painful decision. We had to actually do the following. We had to share with the people, we're going to transform the factory completely. We're going to shut it down, close it, retool, which would take about 3 months. All the 200 people their posts would be made redundant, or those who are close to retirement would retire. And we employed a new set of people who typically had 3 CXE subjects, who could work in teams and solve their own problems on the manufacturing floor, rather than what happened before, which was what Nigel was saying about how do you find a way to work more efficiently within the organization. Because I remember I would go to that factory and I would see a box, and I said, no, this box can't stay there, you need to move it. And this gentleman would say, boss, I don't move box, I want to sweep floor. So the level of people had in their minds a level of specialization that they were fixed with and couldn't see a future for themselves that was very different. So that's what we had to do, and it worked. That's the way, actually, one of the main ways Grace Kennedy, through that massive transformation, doubled our productivity within 5 years in the 1990s. And some of the factories were able to do it without having to do that, because there are employees who said, yeah, I said it like, I can manage that and make the effort initiative to do that. So it's very, very tough being an effective leader in today's environment, because you have to make unpopular decisions that you get criticized for.
Yeah, but
I don't know.
I agree. Yeah, and as chairman of the board, when you sit there as chairman of the board and you are responsible for strategy, right? Because the chairman has to lead the board in setting the strategic direction, and you have your parent company coming in, and that strategy is not dovetailing with what on the ground you see as what is necessary to make this local company perform. And we're not now talking about Grace, we're just talking about, could be Scotiabank or NCB now is in that position where they are, the parent companies here, they'll have entities abroad. Cable and Wireless, parent in the UK, or no, now Liberty, parent in North America. How does the chairman navigate that dissonance between what the local view is and what the parent?
All right, well, first of all, I would say that's a role for the CEO.
You think?
The chairman of the board to set policy and to ensure that policies adhere to. The CEO is the one who has to make those decisions when he's
strategic direction. Strategic direction.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes from the CEO. That's what he gets paid to do. There is a retired PwC director in the 80s who was doing some work for Grace Kennedy. We're just starting off on governance and evaluation. And he said this to me, Doug, there's one role for the board. It's the most important one. And in fact, it is the most, it could be the only one. It is to hire the right CEO,
The right CEO.
sure he or she performs, reward them if they do, and if they don't, fire them. So that's the answer to the question. That's what's needed, and that's why you're seeing such high turnover of CEOs in the developed world today. But that is a tension that exists. But how do you resolve that internally? Then you have to be inclusive in terms of your strategy development, and use a combination of a top-down approach and a bottom-up approach. So, for example, you can say, we are in the banking business, let's say. So that's what we're going to do. So if somebody in a local subsidiary comes along and says, well, we want to get the life insurance as well. You said no, because our skill set is commercial banking. But if you want to do it in a particular region or neighborhood or town, then that person knows exceedingly well how best to do it. And what you need to do is to provide a way for them to flow their ideas upward in or across the organization, so that their views can be heard and you can make a decision on it. But the issue is that if you're going to say, I'm going to move from 20 branches to 15, it's always going to be a highly emotional issue. In the same way that I said earlier on, that one needs to have a formal entity reduction policy to ensure that you actually determine how many subsidiaries you have, and say, is it necessary for us to have so many of them? Do we need to merge some, sell some, or whatever? And also remember one other thing, Camille, especially if you're a publicly listed company, shareholders are much more unforgiving than they were 30 years ago. So they said, look, you're not making the right decisions. I'm very unhappy. I'm going to come to your AGM. I'm going to give you a hard time. We haven't got to the stage in the Caribbean like what's happening abroad, where they'll come and vote out some of the directors and put in some other ones. But that may well start happening in the future. I don't know if that answers your question, Camille. I'm willing to explore it further. You can give me another example. You can give me another example without names.
Terry has a question or an observation. Terry.
An observation. Well, first, my first observation is that I'm absolutely very delighted to see Douglas here and to hear him. I consider him to be one of our Caribbean business gurus. So I'm really, I mean, I'm between watching football and listening to Douglas. That's how compelling you are, Douglas. But I wanted to kind of pick up on the point about the tension between the parent and the subsidiary, right? And the role of the parent board versus the subsidiary. And it's a point we are grappling with now here in the context, as I say, at Republic Financial. We grapple with it all the time. And that tension is going to become even more pronounced as we try to incorporate these notions of these ESG notions and so on into our thinking. I think certainly 20 years ago, Douglas will recall, because he was there, in that position. So we were very clear about what the business was about. And the business was about creating and increasing shareholder value. That's what it was about. And the metrics that we were using to determine that were very clear. And that determined success or failure, it determined your bonuses, it determined your employee stock option plans, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now that we have this ESG coming, and this ESG thing is very amorphous, there are no metrics that define it as yet. I can envisage that we are going to have a lot of tension between a subsidiary. So I have a subsidiary in some other part of the world, for example, in Africa or in South America. And there are a set of considerations there. Camille talked about closing a branch, right? And I think about a multinational like Scotiabank, which has very clearly decided that as far as its interest in the Caribbean is concerned, it has taken a strategic head office parent decision that it is withdrawing from these markets in the Caribbean, irrespective of whether or not the particular market would, from the local point of view, would seem to be profitable and so on, but it does not meet what parent company determines is its threshold for profitability or shareholder value and so on, and it says, I'm closing down that business. And you can create, therefore, that kind of tension between what you might see as the subsidiary's interest or the company's interest in that particular territory versus the head office interest. And as I see that this ESG thing being rolled out more and more, I think that we are going to find a lot more of that kind of tension emerging around ESG type issues, not just simply issues about whether or not the subsidiary meets your profitability or your return on capital threshold, but whether or not these other considerations are now being brought into play in terms of what the head office does or does not do. So I just wanted to offer that comment.
Well, thank you, Terry, and great to see you. Terry is the person who gave me this phrase, "We like it so," which I think is the name of. He actually was a guest speaker at a Grace Kennedy Directors Forum in Trinidad, where, as part of our directors training, what we did in those days, we'd go to a different country every year and spend a few days getting to understand the businesses that we had there. So thank you, Terry. I quote it all the time. And also that the fact that we behave the way we do is not cultural, it's context, which is why you will see all of us Caribbean people lining up at Miami Airport to get on the flight. But when we get to Kingston or Port of Spain, we start jumping over the ropes to jump the queue 2 hours later. And I always point out, hey, all you have to do is change the context and we'll behave perfectly. You just need to make sure you enforce the rules consistently. Yeah, okay, so to answer your question, all right, here's the way I would answer that one. Nature abhors a vacuum. So if a multinational wants to withdraw from the Caribbean, there are going to be others, and hopefully it will be indigenous companies who are going to jump in and fill the gap. And I see that happening around me, and it's wonderful to see it happening, because if you think about in many industries, who owns those entities now? Is it the traditionalists from 50 or 60 years ago from the Northern Hemisphere? It shifted dramatically, and I can think of one example, which is in the public domain in the Eastern Caribbean, which you may have read about, where Scotia has made a decision to change their position in a particular industry, and there is a Caribbean group that seems likely to fill that space. I don't know if you know the one I'm talking about, but ask Nigel, you know about it. So, so there's an opportunity there for others in that regard, but there's something else that you have touched on that is absolutely fundamental, and that is, unlike my generation, and I'm 73, a 25-year-old today who is a tertiary graduate doesn't want to work for a company that's going to make the world a worse place. And that's very different from 50 years ago. So what I see going to happen by self-selection, companies will be forced to change their strategies in order to attract the best and brightest people to work with them. You see it happening overseas, and I believe it's going to happen even more so in the Caribbean. Certainly, my children's generation think and speak and act that way. And they say, I don't like what this company is doing because they're polluting the environment, or they're too harsh on their workers. So I believe that's why I've devoted my time over the last decade since I retired to the younger generation, because it's their world. They're the ones who are going to define what that new world is like. And ESG, wonderful. But then ultimately, they're going to have to define how you actually determine what is success with those new parameters. And I don't know what the answer to that one is in terms of ESG. by the way, one of the things that have and it continues to happen at Grace Kennedy, there's been a philosophy in Grace Kennedy that when you do good, you don't tell anybody. We just do it. And then CSR came along and you started to see a lot of other companies in the newspaper with this big check saying I just gave away $1,000. But I said, hey, wait a minute, I'm sure they paid the PR company more than that to get the picture in the paper. So, yeah, but we feel that's the right approach, which is, you know, do good and people will recognize, because people, ordinary people have their antennae out. They can pick up good people from bad people, and they can sense when somebody is being genuine with them. So, yeah, so I think what we need to do is to listen to the younger generation and see what they're actually telling us. And I'm curious to know if there are any younger people under the age of 40 on this call who can tell me that the answer to that. Let's see if anybody goes into the chat and say, how different would you like our companies to function? I'd be curious to hear. All right, okay, the youngest person on the
the youngest person on the call.
On this call.
Yes, I myself.
I don't know how you're going to determine that.
You have to put up the hand.
I think Terry has gone back to football.
So I wanna go back to the tension between the functions and the businesses. In Citibank, one of the things we did back in the early 2000s, and we started in Asia, was to have regional service centers, and we had financial reporting operations, and I'll be very careful about the words: financial reporting operations, human resource administration, the procure to pay processing, the courier services, the security services, that kind of stuff. And the whole idea there was to using the technology, because the technology was becoming available, to centralize the reporting, the call centers, of course, and the provision of the service in the case of the call centers to the ultimate customer, but to the others, it was to the internal customer. And the distinction we made very carefully was between the operational aspects of human resources or accounting and finance or procurement, and the strategic aspect. What I find as we start to look at that sort of shared service arrangement is that the leadership of finance or human resources or IT or whatever are trying to dictate to the business what their strategy should be, as opposed to providing a service to the business to help them to deliver the strategy. What has been your experience in that regard?
Well, it's simple. That is a decision that needs to be made at the board level and then communicated to the group CEO. So if you make a decision as a strategic direction that you're not going to use any Apple computers, you're only going to use Microsoft, that's it. So there may well be a subsidiary that in the entrepreneurial days of learning to use computers, they went the Apple route and it worked great. And you know, Apple users are incredibly loyal. But then you say, look, you can't have 90% of the group working on you know, a Microsoft platform and 10% on Apple. So you have to change. and they're going to be very upset, but there's no other choice to make because it will affect the entire group in the long run. So yes, there are decisions, but then what we have to do is to make sure that people don't feel, well, it's because Nigel Romano is the IT manager and he's got too big for his boots, because I used to know him from Woodbrook days when we used to get too uppity. So we have to make it clear that it's part of the strategy. You know, what I've found is once ordinary people in inverted companies understand the strategy, they're the ones who are in the greatest support of it.
Exactly.
I remember this case where, you know, as I told you about the 1990s, and we had to do these massive restructurings, and I went ahead and did it, and I was speaking to the 100 or so people in the room, said we have to change the way totally we do things, and it means going to affect the careers of many of you. One of them came to me afterwards and said, Mr. Orane, I take all I want so long to see what was going wrong. So he had what I call the worm's eye view. In other words, he is what you would call at the bottom of the organization, but looking up, he could see all these inefficiencies because he was seeing them every day. We were only seeing it probably monthly or quarterly through, you know, reports from internal audit or something else. But he was seeing it live. And so one of the keys is to listen very carefully. One of the things that Don has continued, and he publicizes it regularly, he makes himself available every week at a specific time slot. I think it's a Wednesday, that anybody in the group can get in touch with him, either by email, phone call, WhatsApp, whatever. It's a very powerful tool that I found helped me tremendously. And what I found happened, I got a lot of great ideas from it, because people would come and say, I see something not doing right or going right. What can we do? Or even if they don't use it, they know it's there. So they say, well, I feel a lot more comfortable in that regard. So, you know, we're now moving into the cultural area, which I think is really goes to the heart of how you run companies, because ultimately it's culture that drives behavior. And that's why probably one of the biggest changes I've seen is the role of the HR chief in the company. Before, it used to be somebody who in the early days, way before almost my time, HR manager was more like a trade union representative. He said, well, what CEO, what more benefits you're going to give to the staff? The question that modern HR manager is asked is how we're going to create value for the organization using the power of our people who are such good people, so they can live lives at a higher standard of living. And that's a huge change for an HR person to make, but it's an essential one.
Definitely. Camille had a comment. She says, doesn't the board have the responsibility to approve, example, the 5-year strategic plan? Terry said, yes, but the plan emerges from the work of the CEO and the senior management team. What are your thoughts?
Well, the reality is that strategy is an interactive process. So you have a split role now. You have a non-executive chairman, you have a board of directors, and you have a group CEO who typically will be a board member. And he may be the only board member. You may have your group CFO on the board as well. And that's another huge change that's taking place, where almost all of the boards, modern boards, are non-executive directors rather than executives, which is good. But it's interactive. So a good CEO is going to be constantly interacting with his directors, not only formally every month or two or quarterly, but also on the phone, saying, I have a new idea, what do you think of this? Look, we have the big advantage in today's world, we have the ability to network so easily. So an idea comes up, this Friday afternoon. If you're a good CEO, you get on your WhatsApp group and say to the board of directors, I have a great idea that just popped up at 3 o'clock this afternoon, but we need to move on it quickly. Can you give me a feedback? And you get the feedback by tomorrow morning, and then you can move ahead. So now that's the kind of way that nimble organizations work. And we need to use it a lot more. By the way, it allows me to segue into something I've noticed that in the new dispensation, we need to figure out how to do it. I attend a lot of online meetings, more and more, to the point where I have to now say I'm being very selective. What I'm finding is very often they're lasting longer than face-to-face meetings. Originally, they used to be shorter. I'm an engineer, I'm not a psychologist, but here's my reason. When you're online like this, it's harder to pick up non-verbal cues, like people are getting bored or distracted. Well, first of all, if they're bored or distracted, they turn off the video, so you wouldn't know. The second one is they could be reading their, if you're in a face-to-face, you can tell because you see the person reading their cell phone underneath, just underneath the table. But when you're online, you can't tell. And also, it's much more difficult to interrupt people, like interrupting me now. If you have a point to make, unless you really get adept at the technology and put your hands up. So what I'm finding is that we need to find ways to make online meetings vastly more productive than the way we're currently using them, because we run the risk that they become commoditized, that they become just another meeting. So that's something else. But here is the key to it. If you ask a 22-year-old, I asked my nephew in Toronto, I was preparing something to put online. And he said, Uncle Doug, it's too long. Look, on TikTok, our attention span is 10 seconds. So don't put so he was exaggerating, but most people, for example, don't watch videos for longer than 30 seconds. So if you have a presentation, bear that in mind. I have a Harvard Business School colleague. He said he had a role. He was one of the founding partners of Monitor. He said one of the things he did in order to concentrate people's minds, and this may well apply to those subsidiary managers out there. He says, if you're going to do a PowerPoint, you're only allowed one slide. And you can talk that, but don't bring 40 slides and then read. We learn to read when we're in primary school. So I throw that in because you're getting into the cultural context now of how do you build group cohesion across subsidiaries, parents, and across countries. One of the things I'll share is it's very doable. One of the things I asked Don Webby recently, I said, Don, you know, the 2020 vision, we basically achieved it to become a global group, certainly in food, which is one of our objectives. But it's very hard for the ordinary person to visualize. I said, tell me something. How many square feet of distribution space do we have in the world, and how much is outside of Jamaica? And he gave me the figure. We have 750,000 square feet of distribution center spaces that we do this deliveries from, but only 330,000 of it is in Jamaica. 56% is in the UK, Canada, and the United States. But, and maybe that's a good example for Camille. If you were to go into any one of them, you couldn't tell which country you're in because the way they have now been configured in the modern environment, they look exactly the same. And so that's where you get the economies of scale and the efficiencies. And as far as I know, they probably moved to a situation where they're all using the same software platform. That wasn't the case when I retired, but I know that was the direction they were moving in. So, yeah, I'm talking to you.
Yeah, no, I want to pick up a couple of points that that Douglas kind of glossed over in talking there. What the first is, I really go back to kind of pure governance issues. You glossed over a point which I would like you to probably make again, and that is that we probably ought not to have these sets of executive directors on the board. I'm saying that I was one, where you have the CEO and you have other members of the executive team who are also directors. You did indicate that that is probably not, it is going away, and it's probably a good thing. And I'd be grateful if you could sort of elaborate on that, because again, that's also one of the issues that we are grappling with. And the second issue, if you could kind of just touch on for me a little bit, has to do with the question of board tenure. In particular, so just by way of background, we've always made the argument in the Caribbean that finding good directors is not easy. And I suppose it has to do with our own sort of frame for selection and so on, and the biases that we have and so on. And so therefore, we've had a situation where board tenure tends to be very long because we keep people on, okay? Whereas in the UK, for example, if you have served three-year terms, 9 years, you are no longer considered independent. What are your thoughts on the question of board tenure now in the Caribbean context? How do we go about the process of widening the pool to bring new directors in, particularly, I would say, perhaps younger people onto our board? So those are the three questions for you: executive directors, the question of board tenure, and enlarging the pool of directors in the region.
Okay, thank you. You're spot on those questions. Okay, the first one, finding a pool of directors. This notion that the pool is small in the Caribbean is absolute nonsense. That's only because we all go into the same cocktail parties, and that's a group of people that we tend to choose directors from. And so we have to disabuse ourselves of that mindset. So here's what we have actually done before I retired. The first one is we looked at the diaspora. And we have all, from the late 90s onwards up to now, we have had members of the Caribbean diaspora who live overseas on the parent company board. And it's one of the most wonderful innovations to broaden our perspective. They're actually the most dedicated directors also in terms of their diligence for preparation. And they also bring a cultural aspect, which is, guys, you need to do things on time in the Caribbean. I'm getting impatient with you all. Hurry up and do things in an orderly way. And that's a real important catalyst. The second group, we actually did it, and it's an example, but you can go wider. I said, look, if you're the principal of a high school in the Caribbean, you could run Grace Kennedy. And people say, why? How can you say that? I said, because they're running a high school with hardly any resources. When you're CEO of Grace Kennedy, you have lots of resources. You have, 8, 10 qualified people reporting to you. You have all the resources you need. They have virtually nothing, and they manage to produce absolutely first-class products, which is bright 18-year-old graduates. So we have. I'm actually on another board with some high school principals, and they're fantastic. So that's one place to look. But you could look in the educational sphere, and that's very common in the developed world, to look to academia to pull one's directors from. The next one is to look at very young people. We tend, for whatever reason, I think we have drifted away from that. I said, look, it's nothing new. Carlton Alexander appointed Oliver Clark and Johnny Stuff and Gordon Sharp and Chris Bovell, who are all outstanding business people in their early 30s. Today, you appoint somebody who's in their early 30s, they say, hold on a minute, he's too young. But he says, look, Carlton said, look, I'm taking a calculated risk, I'm bringing them on, and he was right. So so to answer your question, we just need to widen out our choices. I think one of the things holding us back in the developed world is a whole industry that has developed to recruit non-executive directors, and you pay for that service. And maybe we're being penny wise and pound foolish. Maybe we need to use that approach. On the issue of tenure, I agree with you. I don't know if you're on the call earlier, but I said that we have developed a culture of gerontocracy, or inherited a culture of gerontocracy historically in the Caribbean, and fallen in love with old people running organizations. We need to get out of that. 9 years is just fine. But here's the good news. When we interview young people who are potential candidates and we ask them, how long would you prefer to stay on this board? They said 3 to 6 years. Before you'd ask that question 30 years ago, and they said, well, I'm here for a lifetime. So I think the combination of those gives us the answers in that regard. Regarding executive directors, again, I speak to the facts. Grace Kennedy, when I joined, we had 24 directors, 20 executive directors and 4 non-executive. So I basically ran like an operating committee. And people say, but how could that be? Well, it was actually a very astute strategic move by the then chairman, Carlton Alexander. You will remember in the 1970s in Jamaica, you had massive emigration of basically the managerial classes from Jamaica. And it was before my time. I wasn't with the company. But what I've heard is he came to a conclusion which made absolute sense. If you were the CEO of a subsidiary, he said, I'll make you a director of Grace Kennedy, provided you stay in Jamaica. So the board expanded from about 7 or 8 up to 24. And it worked because the company held its key people. Now, in today's world, there are different ways of holding onto your key talent, and it doesn't mean having a board seat. At that time, it was seen as something of tremendous status. It's actually an impediment today, because if you need to move, you always need to move your people around from one position to the other. And if we conflate a board position with an executive position, then it's much harder to do that. So I think we're getting there. And also the fact that if you do annual board reviews and you say, okay, you've been on the board 2 years, how much longer you want to stay, you get an idea. We will work towards that solution over time. By the way, Nigel, there are a couple points I wanted to make before it closes, and we have 7 minutes. Go ahead. Okay. Go ahead. Okay. The first one is on what's the value of corporate governance. So McKinsey did a study. I came across it long, 2001. But the study, in effect, demonstrated that shareholders will pay a premium for companies that are well governed compared to those who are not. And what's the premium? In Asia Pacific, 20 to 27% premium. Latin America, 21 to 28% premium. Europe and the USA, 18 to 22%. But the conclusion from that analysis was the more corrupt a country is, the higher the premium shareholders will pay for the shares of a publicly listed company. And so those corporate governance hesitators who said, well, I can't see what's the practical use of all this stuff. You know, it's a load of nonsense. There's a very practical reason for it. Think of it this way. A multinational coming into the region and they want to do business for the first time. Who are they likely to do business with? They'll check around and people say, what's a well-governed company that's transparent, efficient, and has good governance practices, and one that is opaque? Well, you know which one they're going to choose. And therefore, that's a huge competitive advantage to have. The other point I would make is that, and this is about the media. And as I said, I'm on the board of RGRB. You know, one of the issues we face in the Caribbean and worldwide is the effect of two industries, what are called the hyperscalers. These are the large companies like Google and Facebook that are carrying news stories for free that are produced by other people, like the Express and the Guardian in Trinidad and the Gleaner and the Observer in Jamaica. And they don't employ one journalist worldwide. So they're basically getting all this content for free, putting it up and getting revenues now by turning around and putting it on their platforms, and then garnering advertising, which is paid to them. Guess who is paying for those ads? Trinidadian and Jamaican and Barbadian companies. So the effect it's doing is to funnel off the advertising revenues in the Caribbean back to the hyperscalers who have no journalists employed to do the news stories that cause people to go to their platform. It is a huge systemic threat. And I think 99% of the people in the Caribbean don't realize it. Why is it so dangerous? Can you imagine how your country would run if you did not have an independent, sustainable, and profitable media, whether in print, television, or radio? And the facts are clear. Research was done in the United States. Wherever there were regions, well, not smaller than regions, where there are towns, cities in the United States where their local newspaper closed down, the rate of interest that the local governments could borrow at increased. And what was the reason why? When they explored it, well, they assumed that because there's no media watchdog present any longer, the governments in those locations, those counties and cities and towns would be more corrupt. So they'd have to charge more interest to protect themselves. We don't want that to happen in the Caribbean. So we need to be aware of this, because you will have seen, and this is a huge governance issue, I must say, Australia made the right move. They actually passed a law earlier this year that the hyperscalers have to pay for content. And in fact, you remember Facebook withdrew from Australia, but they had to capitulate 48 hours later. Our governments need to be going in that direction also, in order to make sure that we continue to have a vibrant media, which is independent and able to share with the wider society news that come from reliable sources. So I don't know if there's anybody from the media on this, but go on, go and tell them, or better yet, go and tell your ministers of government, because it's something I don't think fully understood. And I think there may be a concern, how can little countries move on our own? Well, if we got together through CARICOM, we'd have much better clout. And also the United States and other countries are starting to move in that direction. We need to move in tandem with them.
Yep.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
The opportunity to put that in at the tail end.
Thank you very much. That was very, very insightful, very enlightening. I like that thing about the value of corporate governance. Excellent stuff. Before I hand it, and I want to thank you for taking the time and preparing to share your thoughts and your experience with us. Before I hand it over to Kamla, I want to address your Apple reference, because I can tell you I joined Citibank in 1988, and I joined Citibank with my Apple Macintosh. And of course, I was able to develop all my spreadsheets, etc., etc. But of course, Citibank was a Microsoft, a PC organization. And I told them, okay, bring in 1988, Microsoft launched Excel and Word on the PC for the first time. And I said, okay, I will try it. And they brought the computer, and I opened up my spreadsheets. And I remember Excel opening 3 of my spreadsheets out of a 21 suite and crashed. And I said, get this crap out of my office. I will continue to use my Apple computer. So I thought I will share that with you. Eventually, of course, I I still use a Macintosh today, but in the corporate world, I use the PC. But Kamla, over to you.
Thank
Well,
you
that shows
so-
customer loyalty. You have to, hey, you know the lesson to learn from that, that we can't be teaching our techies only technology. They have to be teaching the soft arts. The reason Apple is so beautiful to use is because Steve Jobs studied calligraphy at college. So he said, it must be technologically advanced, but it must be beautiful as well.
It must be beautiful. It must be beautiful. Come on.
Yes, very true. But I would say, as someone whose first computer was also at Apple, I myself enjoyed, that loyalty. But also, I've heard many who argue that to get some of the quality of work that you want done, there's nothing to compare with a MacBook. So I would respect those choices for the people who have to use those, which means there need to be some measure of flexibility if we want to ensure that we have that quality of effectiveness, because we need to recognize that you can't have one policies that has no inflexibility, because it can lead to some adverse results to what you actually intended. But Douglas, I also want to say that this last point you shared really hit home. As a former journalist, I have been looking at the struggles that our newspapers are having here in Trinidad and Tobago, and how it is they're going to survive in this new world where everyone is online. And even as we took decisions here at CCGI to advertise in the newspapers here in Trinidad and Tobago and around the region, we did have to confront that question as well, in terms of, are we getting value? Because how many people are actually reading the newspapers anymore? But it's such an excellent point you have made in terms of the tremendous need for us to support free media, because they serve as a watchdog, and they in turn then have such a fundamental impact in the way so many things happen within the country. So, you have just really doubly proven the point of why we need people with experience and expertise to provide guidance, and provide that guidance in the boardroom as well, where a lot of decisions are being taken in organizations that can have very adverse impact, which those of us who are in the day-to-day operations may not see and recognize. And I found there was just so much value in this discussion. We could have actually continued for another hour, because I wanted to really explore too the point of the changing structures that we see some conglomerates having, because they recognize through this pandemic the use of technology, the fact that you don't need so many more physical spaces to house employees. And so a lot of changes are taking place at the moment. And even to the point that they are looking at their whole governance structure and whether in fact they need to have as many boards as they do for their subsidiary companies and all that. But it doesn't end here. There will be more opportunities for us to discuss and explore these areas. So we are at 4:33. Our next session will begin within the half hour. And I'm seeing a question from Stasha Marie. Is CCGI considering getting on Instagram and other social media? Actually, we are. We are huge on LinkedIn. We also do have a Facebook page. We do have an Instagram page. We are very much in social media because it does get your word out. And I think we have been using it to a great extent. So it's finding that right mix as well. And yes, Douglas, I see your hand up, so I'm certainly going to pause because your words of wisdom.
I didn't know you were a former journalist, so now I have an ally in Trinidad to consult with. Here is what one of the solutions is for the future, and I'll share it with everyone here. Ultimately, every print media in the Caribbean needs to move to a subscription model. You will buy a newspaper, hard copy, and you don't mind paying for it. One needs to have a mindset to say, I will buy the same thing online. After all, I subscribe to the New York Times and the Guardian, and I read them every day. So, and I'm sure other people do. The question is, we need to do it. It's not only for convenience reasons. It's because it's really an investment in having an independent media for the future. And so if you haven't subscribed yet to one of your newspapers online, do so now. The attitude is, well, it's for free, it's okay. I don't know how long that will last, because I may not be around in the future for you to get it free any longer. So
exactly.
Look forward to you subscribing to the Gleaner online.